Alright folks, welcome back. In this video we're going to practice reducing roots and radicals once again. Let's jump right in. Remember, reducing roots and radicals means to get it down to a point where there are no more perfect squares underneath the radical. So, our example today is 1500. So the square root of 1500. It's fairly common for us to see nice big numbers underneath the radical and be asked the question, well, is that a perfect square? Or if it's not a perfect square, what is the square root of it? Meaning, what is the reduced form of this radical? And again, the way we want to do this is look for numbers which are perfect squares that go into 1500, or that go into this number. And then once we have that product, we break it down using the product rule, and there we go. So here, how do we do this? How do we figure out the square root of 1500? Well, we ask ourselves, what perfect squares multiply together, or what numbers multiply together, one of which is a perfect square, that makes 1500. And a lot of times, if we have trouble trying to figure out what these numbers are, we can start small. But often when we have numbers that end in zeros, it's easy to think big, meaning hundreds, right? Numbers that end in zero, like maybe 100. 100 times what would make 1500? The answer there is, well, 15, right? This is the same as the square root of 100 times 15. All right, and we can break this up using our product rule. Remember, the product rule says if I have a product under the radical, I can rewrite it as the product of two radicals, meaning the square root of 100 times the square root of 15. Now, the square root of 100, we know that 100 is 10 times 10, so the square root of 100 is 10. And that is times the square root of 15. Now we ask ourselves, are there any numbers that multiply together to make 15, right? Is there a number that multiplies by itself to make 15? Is there a perfect square that goes into 15? The answer to all of those questions is no, right? The only numbers that multiply to make 15 are 3 and 5, and neither of them are a perfect square. So this right here is our reduced radical, 10 times the square root of 15. Now, once again, let's say you didn't think of 100 off the top of your head and you wanted to start small. What are some smaller numbers that multiply together to make 1500? Well, let's think about it, right? So we know some perfect squares are, for example, 4, right? We know 4 goes into anything that ends in two zeros. Anything that ends in two zeros is divisible by 4. Additionally, we know that 25 goes into 1500. So let's take a look at this. So if we do the square root of 1500, and let's say you do some math, right? And you say, all right, well, I know that 25 goes into 1500. So this is the square root of 25 times what? 25 times 60, right? 25 times 60 makes 1500. Okay, so we do 25 times 60. And we can break this up using the product rule. Remember, the product rule says if I have a product underneath of a radical, I can rewrite that as the product of two radicals, namely the square root of 25 times the square root of 60. All right, now the square root of 25, since that's 5 times 5 makes 25, the square root of 25 is 5. So this is 5 times the square root of 60. Now we ask ourselves, is there a perfect square which goes into 60? The answer to that question is yes, right? We know 4 goes into 60, right? 4 times 15. So using the product rule, well, before we use the product rule, let's rewrite this as 5 times the square root of 60, which is, we're going to rewrite it as 4 times 15. Now, using the product rule, we can rewrite 4 times 15 inside one radical as the square root of 4 times the square root of 15. So 5 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 15. And the square root of 4 we know is 2, because 2 times 2 makes 4. So this becomes 5 times 2 times the square root of 15, which is equal to 10 times the square root of 15, which is the same answer we got before. So once again, you can reduce radicals in several ways. You don't always have to jump to the biggest number. You don't always have to use the smallest number. As long as you're figuring out what perfect squares go into the number underneath the radical, you're good to go. And you know you are finished when the number inside the radical has no perfect squares that go into it, right? No perfect squares go into 15, so we have reduced our radical, and 10 times the square root of 15 is the square root of 1500. All right, guys, thank you very much for checking in. Check back in for more examples. I'll see you next time.